So jumping into our stories, the first one comes from Ars Technica, and the title here is Notorious Crooks Broke into a Company Network in 48 Minutes. Here's how.
Dun dun dun.
So this is a permutation on something we've talked about a couple shows back, where the victim company was targeted by an adversary with just an overwhelming amount of spam. And I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 or 20 different employees at this company were targeted. And the spam that is being sent by the adversary is benign. It's just a nuisance. It doesn't have anything malicious in it. It's apparently off the wall enough that it doesn't really get caught by most of the spam classifiers and whatnot. But it's a ridiculous volume, and the adversary then they've obviously picked their marks, and what they will attempt to do, and what they did in this instance, is contacted the quote victims at their victim company over Microsoft Teams. So that's kind of problem number one. And they purported to be from a help desk, from the company's help desk, offering, basically saying, hey, look, I see that you're having this big spam problem. I want to help you out. And, at that point, the victims tend to be very, I would say, open to getting help because of the amount of spam they're getting. And the request from the actor is to set up a remote assistance session, which in this instance, two of the employees actually fell for the lure and initiated that session. And the article here in Ars Technica does a pretty light fly through of the issue, or of the attack. If you follow the link in the article to the ReliaQuest report, there's I would say a much more detailed analysis of what actually happened, and they walk you through the individual phases and what their recommendations are on how to mitigate and detect each step of the attack as it happened in this instance. But the one thing that was very clear to me when I read through both the article and the report is that the victim company here was very, very, very targeted. There appears to be some indication that one of the service accounts, one of the privileged accounts they had, they used in the attack, they actually already had credentials for, and the belief is that they purchased that through some other initial access broker, but they probably weren't able to use that credential to actually get into the organization. But they very clearly understood the technology stack used by the company. They were also very adept at moving laterally. So once they had access to the employees' laptops, they started using DLL sideloading. They were trying to push out that sideload, basically malicious DLL, using SMB to some other systems. When that didn't work as they had expected, they failed over to RDP to transfer it, and then they used remote PowerShell commands to create scheduled jobs on those other systems, and basically just methodically crawled through the organizations or the victims' network, installing the malware, which ultimately led to the fairly significant compromise in this instance. So, what I liked about the actual report from ReliaQuest, by the way, is that it does a very thorough job of explaining what they observed. Because ReliaQuest was the incident response company, and I, by the way, have no affiliation with them. So, but again, hey, like if you want, not yet.
Not after the incident in Vegas.
That's true. Yeah, no, we're not supposed to talk about that.
True. The judge was very specific on that.
But, I really like the way that they decompose each phase of the attack and provide, both guidance on how to mitigate it and also guidance on how to detect it. Now, I will say that their detection is very focused on their product offering, but it's generic enough, it's described in a generic enough way that I think you can use that for pretty much any reasonable sim or other uh, security application.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me, and we can certainly get into some of the other recommendations, is once you get this flood, if you're the victim and you get this flood of emails and you get IT reaching out to help, which interestingly, by the way, their IT department got great customer service reviews from the victims for being so proactive and reaching out to help them. So, bonus for their CSAT scores. But not allowing your employees to activate any sort of remote access tool, I think, is the key thing that a
Yes.
lot of these are based on. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this, whether it's built-in tooling in Microsoft, whether it's having them load a third party like TeamViewer or something else, or turning on RDP. That seems to be one of the key first stages of this particular attack type of these fake IT department people reaching out to help. That's the first thing they would do, is get that user to grant them access. If they're a legitimate IT department, they shouldn't need that. They should have their own ability to grant access to themselves,
Right.
you would think. The other thing, and I don't use Microsoft Teams, so I'm a little unsure how this works. I've used Slack much more extensively. A third party getting into your Microsoft Teams instance and communicating with you must not look very obvious as a external person if they can appear to be like the IT department. Like in the Slack world, it's just not easy to impersonate someone or a department without already being granted access by an administrator. I don't know how this works in Teams, but this is a thing we've heard over and over again. So there must be a more opaque view of what organization somebody's in who's communicating with you on Teams.
So they actually touched on this in the report a bit, and
Yeah.
and I think we talked about it in one of the prior attack decompositions as well. The adversary is using Microsoft's kind of generic cloud hosted domain. It's on Microsoft.com. And you can create, as a customer, you can create subdomain dot on Microsoft.com. And so what the adversaries are doing here is they're coming up with creative little subdomains like, I'm obviously this isn't it, right? But helpdesk dot on Microsoft.com. It's obviously not, if you're an astute and paying attention, you're going to recognize that isn't associated with your company, but the fact that it has the Microsoft name in it probably lends some credibility to the attacker. I do believe, by the way, that there's also a way for, I'm not super familiar with Teams either, although everything I hear about it is it's a pretty horrible, pretty soul-sucking application. Not because of the technology, just because of the way
You
it's
worked
used.
at IBM forever. You're used to that. Come on now.
I did. I lived through Same Time and Lotus Notes, so
I was going to
yes,
say.
I'm very familiar with that concept. But um, I believe there is a way that you can restrict external parties from accessing your Microsoft Teams space. I think, though, that there are some companies who intentionally do that so they can converse with business partners and whatnot. But perhaps this is an opportunity to rethink some of those decisions. Now,
Yeah.
there was an interesting thing in here too, which I hadn't really thought of, and it's still kind of playing out in my mind. Like, gosh, is this a good idea? Obviously, this ReliaQuest is a security vendor, and I'm not trying to hype them up in any way, but they obviously have some sort of security agent that can help mitigate different types of things. But one of the recommendations is they have a detection capability to detect the that your one of your employees is interacting with a fish via Microsoft Teams, and if the sequence of events in that interaction plays out according to the rule, it actually will disable the Active Directory or the domain account of that employee. So the idea being that if somebody's in the process of falling for a fish, it just cuts it off by deactivating their ID.
Which might be unfortunate for that employee, but stops lateral movement right there and
Correct.
shuts down further exploitation.
Right. And then they further down, and I don't think this is actually done by their tooling, but they make a recommendation that if you see interactive login sessions using accounts that are supposed to just only be service accounts, that you also similarly deactivate those proactively at the as a response to a login event. Now, obviously, you have to make sure that that you're using those service IDs in a way that you think, so you're not creating pandemonium in your IT environment. But that's also a really good idea. And by the way, I think it's a good idea for many reasons, not the least of which is typically there's different password restrictions and password rotation and multi-factor authentication restrictions on service accounts versus people accounts.
Yeah, indeed. I think the other interesting takeaway is how quickly the bad actors try to break out of their initial foothold on the user's machine and move deeper into the environment.
Yeah, so
It's
that
pretty
I think
aggressive.
it was kind of the headline. We buried
Yeah.
that a little bit. That they the adversary here moved at kind of breakneck speed, and the point is, if this trend continues, and one of the points in this article is that ReliaQuest, and the company that wrote the report, is saying, as compared to 2023 and 2024 when this incident happened, their observation is that it's that the time for an actor to achieve their goals is continuing to go down, and this 48 minutes is in line with what they're seeing on average, and that as a defense, as a blue team, that's we're not looking for actors who are on our network for months, weeks or months or even years before they try to do their thing. Like if you're going to want to defend against this, you have to come up with a very different approach to, to detection and response as opposed to what we often have done in the past.
Or just don't use Active Directory.
Yeah, well, I do believe the A in APT still stands for Active Directory. So, but I think we're gonna have to come up with a new term for this. Like APT is it's kind of outdated. Those are the nation states who are typically have a more of a intellectual property theft or surveillance objective to their attacks, and they're obviously they're advanced, and the persistent is that they will tend to be present in your environment for a very long time, moving around very quietly, and the intention is to not draw attention to themselves, as opposed to this, which is I would call it like a moderately sophisticated, fast attacker. So like we have to come up with some new acronym to describe this. Otherwise, nobody's going to take it seriously.
Yeah, we'll get our crack research team on that. I'm sure we can come up with something very clever with a good acronym.
Yeah. Right. So
like high speed adversarial action.
Yeah, well, it has to be pronounceable. Like if you have to,
Mm.
got to be a vowel in there.
All right, all right. We'll work on this. Maybe I'm sure we can come up with something, and we'll put it on a T-shirt.
Absolutely.